I'm Brian Webster. I am the acting chair of Sheffield Green Party. Welcome to you all tonight, and thank you very much for coming along for what is an absolute jam-packed occasion. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here to kick off our local election campaign, working towards the 3rd of May election. So thank you very much to each and every one of you for being here tonight and coming along to hear from Caroline, and also to have a bit of Q&A with Councillor Alison Teal and Natalie Bennett. So just a really interesting hour and a half or so, and I'm really glad you could all make it. First of all, it looks like most people have got seats. Is there anyone who's not got a seat who'd like one? Maybe if those of you who've got spare seats next to you could just raise your hands just in case there's anyone. Good, there's a few. So if you do want to sit down, please do find an empty seat. Feel free to saunter in the course of the events if you need to. Just want to get out of the way a couple of housekeeping bits. We've got toilets here, just turning left out the door. We aren't expecting any fire drills, so if anything goes off, then please do vacate the building in an orderly fashion. And we'll meet outside the area around the Crucible Theatre. We will have at the end a bucket collection, so a couple of people running around with actual buckets for you to chuck in any spare change if you feel willing for the local election campaign and for the room hire for tonight's event. So if you're feeling generous, please do. And in that same vein, we've got standing order forms if you want to give regularly to the local party to support our activities all year at the table there. And finally, you can support the campaign. You can find out more about the campaign day we've got on tomorrow, with morning and afternoon sessions, and you can find out how to sign up to help out over the next couple of months at that table as well. So Peter and Rob will be happy to give you any more information you want. So I'm just going to introduce very briefly our local election candidates for some of the key wards. You know who you are, so I'll just say your name, ask you to stand up, and everyone can see you. So in no particular order, we've got Broomhill and Shirvale Ward, Caltoun Rivers. And Caltoun is trying to become the 2nd Green Councillor in Broomhill and Shirvale Ward, joining Councillor Majid Badgett, who's also the Deputy Lord Mayor at the moment, going to be Lord Mayor later this year, so very exciting there. We've got Martin Phipps in City Ward. Now Martin's looking to complete the team. We've already got 2 councillors in that ward. There's 1 Labour councillor that we're looking to replace with Martin, or get that 3rd seat in May. So that's fantastic. We've got Gleadless Valley, we've got Paul Turpin. Now Gleadless Valley not one of our 3 main target wards, but Paul's a local candidate who's building up quite a team and a lot of enthusiasm, which is absolutely brilliant. Netherwich and Shire, I've heard on the panel here, we've got Councillor Alison Teal. And for those of you who don't know, and those of you who might say from time to time that a vote can't make a difference, Alison was only elected by 8 votes in 2016. So every single door you knock on, every single leaflet you drop can actually make a difference in making sure that Alison remains a councillor after May the 3rd. We're really looking to defend that seat, and it is by far the highest margin this time around. So anything we can do to help out, starting with tomorrow's campaign day, would be absolutely brilliant. And finally, we've got in Walkley Ward, where we had a strong 2nd the last couple of times, Bernard Little. Now those are just a few of the wards in the city, obviously. We'll have candidates right across Sheffield on the 3rd of May. It really is Broomhill and Shirvale City and Netherwich and Shire where we're gunning for the wins. We'll be having regular action days, we'll be having regular sessions. If you want to come out and deliver even 100 leaflets, knock on a few doors. It's not as intimidating as you might think it is if you haven't done any door knocking before. We'll provide full training, and we'd love to see you out there. So keep an eye on the email newsletters, have a chat with these folks if you'd like to at the end, and find out how you can get involved. Now the last thing I want to mention, and it's really important, is the crowdfunder that was launched today, and that's in support of Alison's campaign to be re-elected. So that's on crowdfunder. We're trying to raise at least a couple of £1,000 towards Alison's campaign for re-election. Every little bit you can chip in will be really appreciated, and you can find details of that on Facebook. Just search for Re-elect Councillor Alison Teal, very easy to remember, or go to the Sheffield Green Party website and you'll find full details as well once that's up. So, thank you all very much, and with no further ado, I'll pass you across to Caroline Lucas.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be back in Sheffield. If I can say as well, it's a real pleasure to see Bernard, because I was just reflecting that Bernard was the very first person I met in the Green Party, and we're going back, I think, Bernard, it's 32 years, which is a bit scary, but we were both incredibly young, obviously. But that was quite a formative moment in my life, anyway. But I'm so delighted to be with you, and so excited to hear about your local election plans. I'm really excited to hear already what Majid has already been doing as Deputy Lord Mayor, chairing the first meeting as well of the Council, I think just yesterday, was it, the day before? You know, Sheffield is going places, and this is really exciting. And the question that you've set me to answer, which is why Sheffield needs more elected Greens. You know, this could be an incredibly short speech, because I think all I would say is, well, just look at the Greens you've got now, and why would you not want more of them? Because you've been so blessed with such inspirational candidates and councillors so far, and of course I want to pay tribute in particular to what Alison has been doing over the past few weeks and months. You know, the courage of what you've done has gone right around the country and given hope and strength and inspiration to so many people from the Green Party and well beyond that as well. So thank you so much for standing with us. Not just Alison, I mentioned Majid, and he's done some pioneering work as well, developing those really strong community links between residents and the student community in the city. People like Rob Murphy, who's done tireless work when it comes to transport and working for safer streets. Douglas Johnson making a real difference to the lives of people who have disabilities, for example. You know, the kind of councillors you get when you vote Green are councillors that are really on your side. They stand up for you, they stand up for what they believe in. And believe me, when I go around talking to towns and cities around the country and I see the work that Green councillors do, I can say hand on heart that Green councillors work harder than any other councillors from any other party. And one reason for that is that we don't yet have a tradition. We will, maybe one day soon, but we don't yet have a tradition of people saying, well, I vote Green because my parents voted Green and my grandparents voted Green, and that's what I always do. You know, we win every single vote. We go out there and we win it. And that means that we work really hard when we've got those votes, because we know that we can't take them for granted. And that's exactly as it should be. You should never take votes for granted, but I can promise you that that's the attitude that Greens take. We work incredibly hard, and I just want to thank the Sheffield councillors for everything that you're doing, and to say that, you know, the idea of keeping the seats that we've got, but also building on that and getting more seats, is exactly what we need in this city. You'll know, living here, that you've got pretty much a dysfunctional Labour council, certainly a Labour council that takes its votes for granted. And what Greens do as well is to shake up councils. They ask the difficult questions that others aren't prepared to ask. They really do hold the feet to the fire of other councillors to make sure that they know that what they're doing is being scrutinised and being publicised as necessary as well as a result. So let's keep those Green councillors, let's build on them, whether it's taking steps to divest the council from fossil fuels, whether it's really supporting those residents who are getting together to stand up for the private rented sector because they know that their concerns have basically been dismissed for years. It is Green councillors that are on the side of local people. But what I wanted to talk about a bit tonight as well is that yes, Green politics is vitally needed locally, but Green politics is vitally needed nationally too, and the two things work together. The way I was able to get elected in Brighton was because we'd had such a strong local council base there that had been built on and built on, and from there we were then able to win the parliamentary seat. Natalie got close to it last time, and I know that that will be linked as well to more councillors here in Sheffield being there as that kind of credibility, as that sense that people have of getting used to voting Green. And I just want to say that when we look at the state of the world right now, I think it's pretty obvious that we need Greens in all elected offices at every level, more than we ever have done before. I want to start off briefly on the environment, on the climate crisis, just because, frankly, for me personally, that's what keeps me awake at night, thinking, what is it that we have to do to generate the political momentum to get people to take the climate crisis seriously? It's not as if the evidence isn't there when it comes to the seriousness of what we're talking about. That's, I think, 15 of the 16 hottest years have been this century already. We know that the sea ice is melting. We know that the seas are getting warmer. We know that people's lives already now are being lost as a direct result of climate change. This isn't some distant thing that might happen. This is a real thing that's happening now. And it is still only the Green Party that is taking the climate crisis seriously, that is taking the environment crisis seriously. I think it's quite interesting to see what's happened from the Conservatives just in the last few weeks. And I'm quite sure nobody in this room will have been taken in by Michael Gove's extraordinary transformation from a person who not very long ago was actually working to scrap having climate change even as an item on the school curriculum to now apparently being the champion of it. Well, if he has had a Damascene conversion, then I would welcome it as much as the next person. But I think when we look at the facts, sadly, we can't conclude that this is any real conversion from the Conservative Party. What this is, I fear, is once again another detoxification process for the Conservative Party. They have been looking at the evidence that they're still not very popular, that people don't really like them very much, and they've been told that actually, well, maybe if they posed as champions of the environment, that might make them a little bit more cuddly and approachable, which is quite a nasty thing. Anyway, the point is this, that they launched their environment plan a few weeks ago, the 25-year environment plan. Nobody, I think, explained to them that just because it's a 25-year environment plan doesn't mean that you actually store up all the things that need to be done for 25 years' time. You actually start now, and you start with some targets and timetables and some seriousness. And I worry enormously about, even when it comes to something like the crisis of plastics in our ocean, which of course David Attenborough and his Blue Planet 2 series has done so much to publicise, even with something like that, the idea that the government thinks it is a reasonable policy to say that they're going to try to get rid of single-use plastics by 2042, this is just extraordinary, 25 years hence, certainly not in Theresa May's term of office, and quite possibly not in her term on this. Well, no, it's not difficult to make pledges for what you're going to do in 25 years' time. I could give you a whole list of things that I'm going to do in 25 years' time, but that doesn't actually help with getting action now. So the first thing about that environment plan, of course, is that there are no immediate actions, no actions, for example, on things like a bottle deposit return scheme, which we know can make a real difference. And those of you who are as old as me can probably remember that we used to have such a thing, and we used to be able to take our bottles back to local shops, and it worked really well, and I don't know why we ever got rid of it, but it's an important contribution, and it's done in many other countries, and it does mean that you can reuse bottles. It means that you can recycle them much better because they're cleaner, they're not contaminated with other foodstuffs and so on. So there was no real evidence that they were taking those small steps towards their goal of 25 years' time. But also, there's no sense of any kind of joined-up policy making here at all. And again, coming back to climate change, you only need to look at that as a litmus test for how serious is this government about the environment. And you see, just the week after that environment plan was launched, you had Greg Clark, the business secretary, giving the green light in principle to fracking up in the north. So how can this be added up? How can this be a joined-up, coherent policy when on the one hand you're trying to save the fish from the plastics in the sea, but on the other hand you don't care very much that the sea is getting hotter and hotter and the fish are going to be fried from climate change if they haven't already been killed from ingesting plastic? So this is a real crisis. And so what we're seeing from this government is a government that is absolutely hell-bent on getting the last bit of fossil fuels out of the ground, whether that's giving massive subsidies to the extractors in the North Sea, whether it's giving the green light to more fracking, whether it's building HS2 with all of the environmental problems we know that are associated with HS2, whether it's giving the green light to Hinkley, new nuclear power, even though the economics of nuclear power just simply do not stack up whichever way you look at it, whether it's more road building, aviation expansion, and so on. So, in a nutshell, and I'm sure you weren't anyway, but just don't get taken in by the so-called green trimmings that you're seeing from this Conservative Party. But I have to say as well on that subject that we're not seeing any commitment from the other parties on this issue either, and I'm sure we'll get to talk in the discussion later about Corbyn's Labour Party, but let's not be under any illusion that Corbyn gets the environment either. I mean, when it comes to those big decisions about what kind of infrastructure and crucially, even more crucially, what kind of economy we want, Corbyn is as committed to the next person as more and more economic growth, as measuring well-being through gross domestic product, of again backing more infrastructure expansion. He too is backing Heathrow expansion, Hinkley, HS2. You know, if you really want a party that recognises that our starting point has to be to live in a way that is sustainable within the confines of one planet, then, friends, as you know, it is only the Green Party that has that as our starting point. And because that's our starting point, I will also argue, as I will do in a few moments, that actually that leads us to be far more radical about social justice issues too, because we recognise that social justice and environmental justice are absolutely linked. And if we're not going to create wealth through yet more growth, it means us being far more radical when it comes to redistribution. And my God, is there some space for some redistribution when you look at the grotesque and obscene inequalities of wealth, both in our own country and in the world at large. So again, when it comes to social justice, I would argue that it is the Greens who are there in the forefront. Now, I've managed to speak for maybe 5 or 10 minutes without mentioning Brexit, which I think is quite an achievement, but I am, friends, going to mention Brexit because I do believe that it is one of the greatest threats that we face right now. And it's a threat in many ways, but let me just explain why I think it's a threat in environmental terms, because that linkage quite often isn't made in the media. The focus is understandably on the single market, on the customs union and so on. But make no mistake, when it comes to Brexit, there is a massive environmental hole at the heart of that transition proposal, because right now in Parliament we've been going through the so-called withdrawal bill. This is the bill that is supposed to cut and paste European legislation and put it from the EU statute books onto the UK statute books. And so the government will say, don't you worry at all that lovely environmental legislation from the EU will be on the UK statute book. Well, I worry for lots of reasons. First of all, let's just remind ourselves of how important that legislation is. We're talking about really the crown jewels of environmental policy that has come through negotiation in Brussels. Things like the Habitats Directive, the Birds Directive, the Air Quality Directive. And they have been instrumental in ensuring that our air is cleaner to breathe, that our habitats have got at least a little bit more protection from development, and crucially that the seas around us are also much cleaner than they once were. So it's incredibly important to have that legislation, but it's also incredibly important that you can enforce it. And the bit that isn't being talked much about is the fact that once we leave, if we leave, and I want to say if actually, I think everybody in this room should always say if we leave, because I think there's an increasing chance that we might not, but if we leave the EU, then right now there's no enforceable mechanism to ensure that that legislation is properly being followed. So what I mean is that when we don't have the European Commission, which has been the body that has essentially been monitoring compliance with EU law, and when we don't have the European Court of Justice, which has been the one that's really enforcing it, as it has done on air quality, for example, it was only the threat of pretty big fines from the European Court of Justice that finally made the government sit up a little bit on the air pollution crisis. If you don't have those institutions doing that job, then you've got potentially, yes, legislation on the statute book, but it's sort of zombie legislation. It's not alive. You can't make it operational unless you've got those other two parts of the equation. And so as the withdrawal bill has been going through Parliament, I've been arguing really strongly that there should be domestic institutions with teeth, the real teeth, to make sure that that environmental legislation is monitored and crucially enforced. And we've won it to some extent. The government's saying, yes, yes, we'll bring forward another bill that will somehow, make sure that we have some kind of bodies to do that. But my worry even about that is that we know that there is absolutely no headspace in Whitehall right now for anything that isn't just the mainstream Brexit work. So the idea that they're going to have the space to bring forward a whole new bill and set up whole new institutions and get them all the way through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords by March of next year, I think it's fantasy land. There will be a gap if we're not very, very careful where that law might have been moved across, but there's no enforceability mechanism. And not only that, but there are crucial bits of law that aren't being moved across. So lots of the environmental principles that underpin so many of our laws here, like the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle, those are principles that were set up at European level. They don't exist exactly in terms of the treaty, so you can't just move them across, even if you wanted to. You need to be a bit more creative about how you would transpose those principles. But you won't be surprised to hear that the government isn't too interested in doing that either. And so, for example, when it's come to policies that will perhaps protect us from damaging pesticides or protect us from the latest technologies that might not have been properly tested yet, it has been the precautionary principle that has allowed us to reverse the burden of proof and made sure that it's the corporations who have to prove that the project is safe, rather than us having to prove that it's unsafe. And if we lose that, that is a really big challenge too, and a really big loss. So again, we're pushing very hard to try and fill that environmental gap when it comes to those environmental principles. So that's a little bit about environment and Brexit, but I do want to say a couple of other things about Brexit too, if you'll live with me for it. But it comes back really to the fact that, again, when you look at Labour, where is Labour in terms of challenging this extreme Brexit for which Theresa May has absolutely no mandate? She cannot say that people voted back in June 2016 to leave the single market, to leave the customs union, to end free movement. That was not on the ballot paper. And if she was serious about trying to bring the country together again, then she wouldn't be choosing the most extreme form of Brexit that you could imagine. And so, you know, if Jeremy Corbyn wanted to, he could avoid the most extreme Brexit. If you had, you know, the courage of some convictions, then he would make sure that we didn't lose that economic advantage, because all of the things that he and the Labour Party stand for in terms of trying to invest further in our public services, education, the NHS, all of that's going to be 100 times more difficult if we are out of the EU, because we will be much worse off. And we've just seen some figures just this last week. I know that those economic models are suspect sometimes, but they are suggesting, even if they are out by a factor of 50%, that's still a massive amount. It's about 80 billion of loss over the next 15 years in terms of not getting a deal when it comes to leaving the EU. So from an economic point of view, it's madness. But I want to say something about the peace process too, and the way in which the EU, I think, has been the most extraordinary peace project, and how concerned I am about the recklessness of what's happening when it comes to Ireland. Because we know that the only way to avoid a hard border in Ireland is to remain part of the customs union. And I can't believe that this government is just being so careless, in the literal meaning of that word, just literally not caring about the fact that there are so many strong voices from both sides, both Northern Ireland and the Republic, saying, do not put a hard border back here. You know, the tensions are still there, and we've been lucky to have 20 years of peace, but there is no guarantee of that. Do not put it at risk. And yet by leaving the customs we'll be doing that too. And finally on Brexit, I wanted to say something about freedom of movement, because I feel passionately about this. I am so proud that the Green Party is the one party that stands up so proudly to say that freedom of movement is something to celebrate. The fact that you can go and work and study and live and love in 27 other countries, I think is the most extraordinary gift. And it's one we should be protecting for our kids and their kids, not one that we just throw away. And I want to say something too to any EU nationals in the audience, because I am ashamed of the way in which this government has used your lives essentially as pawns in their negotiations. You know, EU nationals are our friends, our families, our lovers. They are people that we know and care about, and you have made such a contribution to our societies, not just in economic terms, but in terms of the contribution to our communities, to our culture, and so on. And when I have people coming to my constituency surgeries, as I do, often in tears, when they've lived here for 20 years, and they're now saying that they don't feel welcome in this country, I feel so deeply, deeply ashamed. So I think that when it comes to really, you know, setting out what we care about and the principles that we have, then being an open, welcoming, generous-hearted country is where most people's guts actually are. And why isn't Jeremy Corbyn challenging the tabloids press when they go on about how the reason that people can't get homes or the reason that there are waiting lists in the NHS is because of EU nationals. No, it is not. You know as I know that you're just as likely, more likely, to find the person who's treating you in the NHS being an EU national than the person ahead of you in the queue that's somehow blocking you getting in there. So we know that and we will stand up for that. And I think we will get credit in the wider community and in the wider country for having the courage of our convictions on that, because frankly the other parties just simply don't. Whew. So. Just in my last few words, what I wanted to come back to, I guess, was I said earlier that in some ways I think that our social justice policies are more radical because they come from the starting point of recognising that it isn't just about trying to make the cake bigger and trying to give a slightly bigger piece to each person, because that doesn't really work when you have a planet of finite resources. You know, as I've said, anyone who thinks you can have infinite economic growth on a planet of finite resources is either a madman or an economist. I think that's pretty accurate. You can't. So we recognise that we need different goals out of our economy that isn't just about GDP growth. And when you stop to think about it, measuring the well-being of a society simply by how much GDP growth there is, gross domestic product, which simply only measures how much money is flowing in the economy, that is pretty silly. You know, a big motorway pile-up is wonderful for GDP growth. Think of all those new cars that have to go out and be bought. But in any other measure of well-being, a pile-up on the local motorway is not a good thing at all. And Greens hold on to the idea that we are not just simply economic units, that we are not consumers. One of the things I hate most is the way in which our citizenship has now been replaced by defining us all as consumers. Because if you define people as consumers, and then you're talking about people who don't have very much money to consume, it makes it all the easier not to take their concerns into account. And we in the Green Party recognise that we need to massively change the way our economy works, and we start, I think, by doing that by looking at what we measure, because it's what you measure that you start valuing. And I think that leads us to some quite strong conclusions when it comes to, for example, challenging the power of corporations, challenging the power of the advertising industry. You know, Professor Tim Jackson has a lovely paragraph on this when he talks about the power of the advertising industry, which basically kicks in to keep reminding us you've got to go out and consume more. And he says, you know, why is it that we allow them to persuade us to spend money we don't have, to buy things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't even care about? And I think that encapsulates it pretty well. Because it has environmental implications, but it has social implications as well. Because in that constant competition for status, which is about what so much advertising is about now. It's not actually about fulfilling our needs. It's about trying to persuade us that to have a position in society that is expressed through what we buy or what we wear, that is how we make an impact and an impression. And doing that has social implications as well as environmental implications. Because in a constant competition for status, we end up destroying our beauty spots, we end up turning our art into commodities, we erode our education system. And by pandering to the most selfish aspects of human nature, I think we end up hindering satisfaction and we undermine social solidarity. So I think it's so important that we have a party that not only talks about the huge obscenities of the inequality of wealth both in this country and overseas, the fact that the 6th largest economy in the world and we're heading for 5 million children living in poverty by 2020. How on earth can that possibly be justifiable? And that leads us to some more radical policies, for example, around a basic income scheme, that idea of an unconditional payment to everybody, irrespective of whether you're in work or not, as a basic minimum, as the floor, to make sure that you know that you can have a roof over your head and you can put food on the table. That ought to be a right for people in the 21st century. And I'm proud that now this is a policy we've been championing for 30 years and more, and now eventually it's just beginning to get some pilots going. There's some pilots in Scotland, in Finland, they're doing a bit of work on it too. We need our own government to be looking at policies like that. I was looking as well earlier about land value taxation, which sounds such a mouthful. I wish we could come up with a better term for that, because it just sounds intrinsically boring and I just feel people kind of turning off immediately. But land value taxation is actually really important because it's about replacing council tax, which is a really unequal, unprogressive way of raising money locally and replacing it with something that will not only be a lot fairer, but will also encourage developers to release land for housing so we actually get more affordable housing too. And in a nutshell, you'll probably know that properties haven't been revalued since about the early 1990s. And so essentially the council tax that's being paid is massively out of date given the way in which property has accrued in value since then. And even more appallingly, really, those people who have very expensive houses are not paying very much more council tax than people who just have a, whatever you might think of as a more standard property. And this was brought home to me by looking at some figures last week, which showed that last year the most expensive property that was bought was £15 million, and that was in Westminster. The cheapest was £18,500 in the county of Durham. But the person who bought the £15 million property was only paying £250 more council tax than the person who bought the property for £18,500, which seems to me just a tad unfair. So, land value taxation would mean that you would tax the true value of that, and also you would enable developers to recognise that it doesn't pay them to leave land vacant and not to build the houses that they promised to build, but they're not building them yet because they want to wait until that land accrues greater speculative value. If you tax that land at what its optimal value already is under the planning process, in other words, you tax it as if that property was already built on it, then you're more likely to get developers bringing forward those kinds of properties now rather than sitting on those land banks and having that scandal, frankly, which is a scandal in every single city in Britain, I think, of so much homelessness that's going on. There are a whole set of policies that are leading to greater homelessness, but certainly the lack of affordable housing is one of them, as well as a massively cruel government that seems to be targeting the most vulnerable when it comes to bedroom tax, when it comes to changes in housing benefit and so on. I think I've rattled on for far longer than I should have done. So I'm just going to leave you with my favourite cartoon, which I've done every time I've spoken here, and I've just done it at the university, so everyone else is going to be very bored by it, but I just still really like it. It's a good story. Which is a good story. So the story is this: that Green Party policies not only make economic sense, they're not only good because they're good for the environment, but they have an incredibly good chance of leaving us all feeling much better off in terms of our own welfare, our own well-being. And the little story is of the professor in front of the whiteboard who has been outlining all of the benefits of moving to a zero-carbon economy, a sustainable economy. And so on that whiteboard, she's written things down like more local, affordable food. She's written down more local public transport, less congestion on our streets. She's written down maybe kids playing on our streets again. The fact that we're paying far less in terms of our fuel bills because we're not, we've got properly insulated homes. We're not wasting our money on heating the air outside our homes. So you've got all of this list of lovely things that will happen, but then you've got the speech bubble of the student in the class saying, but what if climate change is a hoax and we've created a better world for no reason? We want to create a better world because we think a better world is what we all deserve. We've got a right to a Green Party. Policies will create that, Green councillors will create that. So please get involved, particularly get involved in this local election campaign. You've just heard 8 votes, is it? Yeah. I mean, imagine the worst. Imagine were Alison to lose by 8 votes. We know where you live. So please get involved. You know this matters. It's the most important thing that does matter. Systemic change is what is needed. And there are real opportunities out there now. So please take them and get involved. Thank you.